When geneticists first set out to place the Ashkenazi Jews on the genetic map of Europe, they expected a fairly boring answer. These were families who had lived in Germany, in Poland, in Russia, in Hungary, for 1,000 years. And 1,000 years is a very long time. Populations that live side by side for that long almost always blend at the edges. They trade a little ancestry back and forth. Marriage by marriage, generation by generation, until they slowly come to resemble their neighbors. So the researchers assumed the Ashkenazi Jews would sit comfortably somewhere inside the broad European cloud. A little distinct, perhaps, a little off to one side, but basically German, basically Polish, basically European. That was the safe, obvious prediction. Instead, the data did something that stopped them cold. It refused to match any of them. Not the Germans, not the Poles, not the Russians, not a single European nation the Ashkenazi Jews had lived among, and prayed among, and been persecuted among, for a full millennium. On the genetic map, they did not blend into Europe at all. They formed their own tight, distinct little island, sitting off entirely by itself, and, stranger still, that island sat closer to the populations of the Middle East than to the neighbors living right down the road. 1,000 years in the heart of Europe, and Europe was barely in the blood. That result should not have been possible. And this is the story of exactly how it happened. Let's start with what the Ashkenazi genome is actually made of, because the answer is a genuine paradox. Broadly speaking, it is roughly half Middle Eastern and roughly half European. It is the genetic signature of a people whose deepest roots run all the way back to the ancient Levant, whose paternal lines trace to the Near East, and whose long story then wound through southern Europe, most likely through Italy, before finally settling into the German Rhineland and pushing east into Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. So there is real European ancestry sitting inside that genome, which is exactly what makes the final result so strange and so hard to explain. How on earth can a population be half European by ancestry and yet still refuse to match any European nation on the map? And if that paradox has you leaning in, do me a quick favor before we solve it. Tap the like button, because it truly helps this kind of history reach the people who would love it. And if you missed the first chapter of this investigation, where we compared Jewish DNA to every ancient civilization and found only one single match, subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders, because this is the sequel, and it only gets stranger from here. Now here is the answer. The answer is the single most important word in all of Ashkenazi genetics, the bottleneck. Somewhere around 600 to 800 years ago, the Ashkenazi population collapsed down to a very small founding group by one major 2014 study, as few as around 350 people, and then, over the centuries that followed, it exploded outward into the millions. That single event is what broke the mold. Because when millions of people all descend from just a few hundred founders in only a handful of centuries, two remarkable things happen at once. The first is that every last one of those descendants ends up carrying overlapping fragments of the very same tiny ancestral set, which makes them genetically resemble one another far, far more than they resemble anyone on the outside. In fact, any two Ashkenazi Jews you pick at random, anywhere on Earth, tend to be something like 30th cousins as related to each other as a small extended family. And the second thing is that they largely stopped blending outward at all. For 1,000 years, in country after country, the community married within itself out of religious conviction, out of cultural closeness, and very often out of the sheer necessity of survival as a persecuted minority hemmed in from the outside. 1,000 years of living inside Europe, and almost no new European ancestry flowing in after that original founding. The island had sealed itself shut, and then it stayed shut. It is worth pausing on how that community actually formed and moved, because the history and the genetics tell one and the same story. The first great Ashkenazi communities grew up along the Rhine River in medieval Germany, in towns like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, communities so central to Jewish life that their Hebrew initials were joined together into a single revered name for the whole region. From there, battered by the massacres of the Crusades and by wave after wave of expulsions, the community migrated steadily eastward, into Poland, into Lithuania, and across the vast expanse of the Russian Empire, where for a few centuries it found relative stability and grew explosively into the millions. But everywhere it went, it carried that same sealed genetic signature along with it, because everywhere it went, it kept marrying within itself. The map of Ashkenazi history is a map of constant movement, west to east. Germany to Poland to Russia, stretched across 1,000 years. And yet the genome barely records a single one of the neighbors along that entire route. The community passed straight through the middle of Europe and let almost none of Europe in. And to see just how unusual that really is, compare it to nearly anyone else. When Germans settled in Poland, when Greeks settled in Italy, when the countless peoples of the continent crisscrossed and conquered and resettled one another's lands over the centuries, they blended. Within a few generations, the genetic lines blurred and merged into the local population, which is exactly, reliably, what history does to a migrating people. That is the default. That is the rule. The Ashkenazi Jews are one of the most striking exceptions to that rule anywhere in the entire human record. A population that moved almost constantly, lived nearly everywhere, and mixed almost nowhere. You can actually see the fingerprints of that bottleneck written directly into the community's health, right down to the present day. When a population squeezes through so narrow a genetic gate, the rare conditions carried by those few founders get concentrated, and then handed down at unusual rates. That is exactly why certain genetic conditions, Tay-Sachs disease being the most famous of them, appear more frequently in Ashkenazi families, and why specific founder mutations, including particular BRCA mutations linked to cancer risk, are common enough that doctors now screen for them by name in Ashkenazi patients. I want to be careful and clear about this, because it is not a story about anything being wrong with the population. It is the exact opposite. Those shared mutations are simply the medical echo of that tiny band of medieval founders, still ringing, faithfully, 800 years later. The bottleneck is not some abstract theory in a journal. It is real enough that doctors quietly work around it every single day. And there is one more layer to it, one that reaches even deeper. A landmark study traced a very large share of all Ashkenazi maternal lines, the direct mother-to-daughter inheritance, back to just 4 founding mothers. 4 women, standing behind millions upon millions of people alive today. And the deeper genetics suggests something poignant about how this community first formed. Paternal lines reaching back to the Middle East, and maternal lines with strong roots in Europe, the genetic signature, many researchers believe, of Middle Eastern men who arrived in Europe long ago, married local women, and then founded a community that from that point forward largely kept to itself for the next 1,000 years. A people quite literally born from 2 worlds, and then sealed. Now I have to say very clearly what all of this does, and does not, mean, because this is precisely the point where people go badly wrong. A distinct genetic cluster is not a pure one. The Ashkenazi genome is, by its own story, a fusion of the Middle East and Europe, a mixed inheritance, not an unmixed one. And a founder bottleneck says absolutely nothing whatsoever about any group being superior or inferior to anyone else on Earth. This is a story about history, not about hierarchy. It is a story about migration, about catastrophe, about survival, and about the specific, stubborn, human choice to remain a distinct community when it would have been so much easier and so much safer to simply dissolve into the surrounding population. That is all it is, and anyone who tries to read 1 ounce more into it than that has quietly left the actual science behind. So here is the picture the data actually paints, once you stand back from it. Imagine a people arriving in Europe 1,000 years ago, carrying the ancient Near East in their blood. Now imagine them nearly wiped out by massacre, by expulsion, by plague and pogrom, and then rebuilding the entire community from just a few hundred survivors. And then imagine them, surrounded on every single side by great and growing nations, choosing, over and over and over again, for 30 unbroken generations, to remain themselves, not blending away, not quietly disappearing into Germany, or Poland, or Russia, remaining a distinct, unbroken thread running straight through the middle of an entire continent closely related to one another, and to the ancient Near East, and yet stubbornly, measurably, unmistakably unlike every single country they actually lived in. That is why the result looked impossible to the people who first saw it. A population is supposed to melt into its surroundings, given 1,000 years. This one simply did not. It stayed an island in the very heart of Europe, and even now, the DNA can still see the shoreline. There is something almost defiant in that, when you really sit with it. Every empire we have ever traced on this channel eventually dissolved into the people around it. That is simply what time does to everyone. The Ashkenazi Jews stand as an exception to the ordinary erosion of history itself. For 1,000 years, the surrounding world made it dangerous, and often deadly, to remain who they were. And for 1,000 years, marriage by marriage, generation by generation, they remained who they were anyway. So the genome is not only a record of ancestry, it is a record of a choice repeated 10,000 times over, in 10,000 small villages and crowded city quarters, to hold on to an identity when letting go would have been so much easier, and so much safer. And the machines in the lab can still read that choice today, plain as ink, 800 years after the last of those few hundred founders lived and died. And that is the real revelation here. Not that Ashkenazi Jews are somehow separate from the rest of humanity, they are not, but that a people can be dropped into the middle of a continent, live there for 1,000 years through everything history threw at them, and still carry the clear, unmistakable genetic memory of exactly where they truly began. And if you are sitting there right now, wondering whether you might be standing on a piece of that very same island, whether this long, strange history runs somewhere in your own blood, I made a discovery kit called Your Jewish Roots to help you read your own DNA, results for these exact fingerprints, and trace them back. It's linked down in the description, if that question happens to be yours to answer. So tell me down in the comments, did you expect Europe to barely register at all? And if you have ever taken a DNA test yourself, what surprised you the most about your own results? I read every one. And thank you sincerely for following this whole strange investigation to the end. If you want to see this bloodline in a single, unforgettable human face, one man who came from this exact founding population and changed the entire world, I have put that video right here on your screen for you. It's playing now. Go and watch it.